Hi, welcome. My name is Vilingor, and in today's video I wanted to tell you about a comic book that is not as well known worldwide as it should be, specifically because it's an Italian comic book that, as far as I know, has not been translated into English, which is very unfortunate, but let's hope it will be translated. But let me first tell you what is the name of the comic, of course, and the comic is this one. Ta-ta-ta! Yeah, the name of the comic is Ja, and this is how it looks like. And it is an awesome, a great comic book in my opinion. Right now there are no new issues written, there are no new issues being published. It's a complete story that ended at a certain point in time, and which is a good thing for a piece of art, for a book or a comic book to have an start and have an ending, to not go indefinitely and become watered down and which sometimes happens with pieces of art, and with this talk of mine that I'm taking too many tangents and I need to stay focused on the topic. So first of all, let me say that, as with every of my video I'm making, I'm trying my best to tell correct informations, but it's just the nature of how I am, because I'm stupid and faulty like everybody else. So some things may be incorrect, some informations may be incorrect, what I'm saying in this video, but just take that into consideration and correct me in the comment section below. It's always a good thing to, be precise and all that, but yeah, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the comic book, of course. So the author of the comic book is Luca Enoch, and the publisher of the comic book is Bonelli Publishing House, Italian publishing house. And so Luca Enoch is doing everything in this comic. The story, the drawing, the whole thing is doing he himself. And that's the reason why this comic was coming out like every 6 months, which is unusual. Usually comic books come out like weekly, monthly, I'm not sure, but usually not like every 6 months. But because Luca Enoch is doing everything in this comic book, that's why it took so long for him to publish a new issue. And frankly, it's done so well that it was not a problem, because one could see there was a lot of effort that was going into making this comic, and also it's a quite thick comic, quite a few pages here. I'm not sure, like 130 pages on this one particular issue, and it was always about that thickness as far as every issue goes. Well, so spoilers alert. Yes, here there will be some minor spoilers here and there. I will try to stay away from revealing the plot story as much as I can, but just so you know that there will be spoilers ahead. So, what is the comic book about? Well, the main character is Ja, that's how it's pronounced, her name in Italian, and she is a teenager girl and she always wears black glasses, and there is a lot of mystery around her at the beginning of the comic book series, which is good. Mystery is good, it creates curiosity, and that's something that is done very well in this comic. And she's a teenage girl that lives alone in an industrial zone of some Italian cities. The setting is an urban setting, and she lives in an industrial building in the suburbs of a somewhat bigger city. And she goes to school, and she's a bass player. She plays a bass guitar in a band, and there is this appearance of normality, sort of, kinda, also, although there are some obvious unusual things about her. But however, it seems like a normal teenager. But then, of course, there are some things that are going on that are way too unusual. However, she is like a sort of a superhero, and she's a guardian. That's what is her sort of a secret identity. She's a guardian of the earth, and she's called a baluardo. Now, baluardo is an Italian word for a defensive part of the wall of the castle, like a defensive structure, like the moat is the defensive structure, the drawbridge is a defensive structure, so baluardo is a defensive structure of the wall of castles. And it is appropriate because Gea is a defender of the earth against the incursions of creatures and monsters from parallel other dimensions. And so that's what she does. And at the beginning of the comic, again, we don't know much about how she became baluardo, what is her job specifically, and so on. Now that's the story, generally speaking. Now let's get into what are some good things about this comic book. Well, first off, the visuals are great, are excellent. The drawings are some of the best I ever seen in comic books. They tend to be on the realistic side of things. That's just the style that Luca Enoch has and likes. And especially the clothes, it's very detailed, and it looks great. Not much to say there. It's just a pleasure to read it. Very detailed, very complex, but very well done. And it's amazing that it's actually done by one person, which is quite amazing. That's such a good comic to be made just by one person. And what are other things good in this comic? There are like small details that just make it so good, and so many good small details. For example, one good detail like that is that throughout the comic, Gea is listening to music, to a lot of different music when she's at home and walking down the street or something. And the music that she listens to is the actual contemporary music of the time, of the 90s. So there is music, I distinctly remember music of Manu Chao. He was quite popular in the 90s, late 90s. Other authors, Bob Dylan and Sting, and I think I don't know how they managed with copyright issues, but there are texts of songs of those authors in the comic, and it gives a special feel to the comic. And there's a bunch of these details in the comic like that just make it so good, in my opinion. There is sex also in this comic, and the sexuality is something that is not just the usual sexuality, male-female sexuality, but there is also all kinds of homosexuality, different kinds of polyamorous relationships. The comic in a way explores indirectly also sexuality. And also the sexuality in the comic is not used as sexuality is today for the most part, to just arouse the reader and attract like sexually the reader, where there are usually these good looking girls with very feminine features that are put in the comics to attract the male audience, and there's not much of that going on in this comic, which I think is good. But on the other hand, it's a mature approach to sexuality, where it is talked about sexuality. There is some sexual attraction maybe there just to attract the reader. Some of it is there, but a big part of it is just talking about and expressing in a mature way about all different aspects of sexuality, teenage sexuality, and mature sexuality, and all kinds of sexuality. So it's something I like about this comic. Then there are naked bodies, throughout this comic, which is a good thing. Again, not necessarily sexually, but Luca Enoch is okay with a naked human body. And here and there, Jaya is naked, and other characters in the comic are naked, and it's perfectly fine. It's not a big deal, and that's something that I like. That's something good. Now, a big part of this comic is, of course, supernatural and paranormal and mythical, and mythical creatures and fantasy creatures of all sorts, established fantasy creatures and invented ones, griffins, elves, dwarves. Those are the established ones, and then there are many others that are just invented by Luca Enoch. And and there's a magic, and this is what the comic is about. And also another good aspect of the comic is the comedy aspect of it. The comic never takes itself too seriously, and there are always, Jaya is kind of funny and she's made fun of, and she's kind of prone to outbursts of rage here and there, and it's done in a way and that is always comedic. And she had bad days and bad stuff happened to her, so that all makes the comic to be not to take itself too seriously and to be lighthearted and funny to read. Then in regard to monsters particularly, maybe it's just good to say also, interesting to say also, that even though there are classical creatures and monsters from mythology in the comic, there is a different spin on them, because the comic book is happening in modern times, in contemporary modern European city. So there is a certain twist to the monsters that makes monsters more interesting in a way. For example, there is one comic book issue that is related to fauns, the creatures that are half man, half goat. They have goat legs with a human torso, the faun. And in this particular comic book issues, it starts that women are disappearing in the woods. And so Jaya is going to investigate what's going on. And what was going on is that fauns were hijacking, were taking women in this forest, and they were taking them to bear children, because fauns are only male apparently, so they needed female to reproduce themselves. But they were also, of course, kind of monsters, because in the world of Jaya, I forgot to mention this, the humanity at large, at least at the beginning of the comic, is not aware of the monsters and the other dimensions. This is just a fantasy to most people. That's how the worldview of most people is in the comics. So when somebody accidentally sees a monster in the comic, it's just like a shock and misbelief and denial and all that. And where was I going with this? And so the fauns needed the girls to reproduce, to have offsprings. And but then the thing is that they were treating these women very well. Yes, it was a kidnapping, and that was not a good thing, but they were also treating these women very, very well, and giving them riches and like gold and rubies and diamonds and stuff. So they were very well set off, these women, for giving birth to the children. And also the children were growing at a very fast pace, I think, also because it was a very short pregnancy, and the birth was aided with some magic and some potions, so it was not painful and all that. So it was kind of sort of not that of a bad thing as it sounds at the beginning and the start. And these fauns were loving of these women, but they were monsters, so they could not just, I guess, approach a normal girl and say, hey, do you want to be my girlfriend or something like that. So it had to be like a kidnapping. And so there are also these kind of moral dilemmas within the comic book that also make them interesting. And Jia in these situations kind of reacts in a... She's trying to be good. She is good-hearted, and so she tries always to kind of understand and deal with the monsters in a friendly manner, in a kind manner, sort of. Although she's annoyed by them because she has to deal with them, and she's annoyed with them because they are invading the Earth and being here on this planet where they should not be, like the fauns, for example. But she also understands when they are not being purposefully evil. So in the case of the fauns, she kind of forgives them and sends them in another parallel dimension where there is another world where they can live peacefully, and the kids and their offsprings are turned into normal kids, I think, through means of magic. So that issue was fixed that way. So that's one way in which Jaya is being considerate and being kind to monsters also and to humans. So she needs to be an arbiter and decide in situations like this what is the right thing to do, which is not always very clear cut. And so that makes for a good story. Other times when Jaya encounters some creatures that are openly hostile and that cannot be reasoned with, there is no mercy towards creatures and monsters that are hostile. And there is kind of instinct that kicks in because she is this baluardo, and it's not very clear, at least at the beginning, how she became a baluardo. There is this instinct within baluardos. It's an instinctual thing to defend the earth against other dimensional creatures. It's almost a programming of sorts. So when there is a monster that behaves in a evil way, Jaya becomes this like very destructive force. And I forgot to mention, the main weapon of Jaya is the use of magic that she learns through time to use throughout the comic. She starts as very unskillful user of magic to getting ever better and better with practice. But to do her magic and to fight the monsters, Jaya uses a sword. And it's a classical European medieval sword, more or less. The only thing is that this sword, she has it shed. She uses the bass guitar that she plays as a shed for this sword. So it's kind of a concealed sword, so she can go around with just the bass guitar on her back, but it's really, there's a sword in it, which is a very cool and very nice idea. And let me see at my bullet points. Oh yeah, I noticed some clear influences in this comic book at the end. It might be interesting to mention them. The obvious influence is the Matrix movie. That's one obvious influence. And one can see this in the way that characters dress up. So there are a lot of trench coats, and a lot of sunglasses in this movie, and kind of fancy hairstyles in this movie, in this comic. And because in the 90s the first movie Matrix came out, and it was kind of a big thing. And there is also the influence of X-Files can be felt. Also a TV series from the 90s, very famous, with Fox Mulder as a main protagonist of the series. And he's like an FBI investigator investigating all sorts of unusual paranormal cases. And there is a character in Jaya, a police officer that is basically more or less Fox Mulder, because he's all into monsters and aliens and kinda he believes all of this to be true, and then he's laughed at by his colleagues and other people because everybody considers him a flake, like just something to be laughed at. But he is actually right, because he follows Jaya and he sees certain things that make him think that this is how things are. Monsters do exist, creatures alien creatures do exist that invade our world, and that's just the reality of it. So there's that influence, there's that element, and in general Luca Enoch borrows from many movies, and this is quite noticeable. He takes ideas from science fiction, from fantasy, from a bunch of movies, from books, culture in general, which is a great thing because all great art is always built on the basis of preceding art. So that's a good thing. And one of the things that stood out particularly to me about Gea is the format of the comic changes through time. Now I will explain what that means. The comic book issues start within a classic standard format of comic books, which means that every story is contained within one issue. So this is the way, like Spider-Man, the classical Spider-Man comics or classical Batman comics are made, which means that every issue is one complete story. And when the one issue ends, there is kind of a reset to the next issue. Because if the main hero maybe was hurt in some way in the previous issue, the next issue he's all well and fine. If the villain was imprisoned or disappeared in the previous issue of the comic book, in the next issue of the comic book he's there again and he's all well and fine, and there is another story with the same villain. Of course the villains get circled around, but there is this reset from issue to issue in classical comic books that is kind of weird, because it creates a sensation of this like illusionary world that kind of never changes. It's kind of perverse in a way, it's kind of weird in a way, it's kind of, if one thinks about it, it's strange how Gotham City never changes. It's always the same. It's strange how these villains, they are always there again and again. Every new comic book issues, same villains again and again and again. So there's this idea of a stagnant world, and in a way it's creepy if one thinks about it. The never-changing world that always repeats and always is the same. So this is something that classical comics did. And Gea starts that way, where every comic book issue is a self-contained story, even though there are some elements that transition from issue to issue, like for example the love story that Gea has with this guy that is in a wheelchair, a disabled guy that plays in her band that she plays with. He plays the drums, and this love story kind of evolves through different issues, and that's a step away from the classical division where every issue is a separate story. But then what happens as the comic book story progresses of Gea, what happens is that with time the story becomes more and more connected between comic book issues, and in the end it's one continuous story that is not anymore contained fully just in one comic, but it's linked. It's that's something that changes with time. And also the world changes. So at the beginning the story of Gea is kind of a small. It's just a story about this girl and these single monsters that encroach upon the Earth territory, and she has to deal with them. And then the story gradually becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And then there is the organization of Baluardo gets involved. At first it's just Gea, then the entire organization of Baluardo gets involved. Then there is the enemy, that are these sort of demonic entities that live in the city, and they are like these high society people that look like human, but then they are demons that are involved with the government, and they are like a secret organization that is trying again to conquer the world, the earth, for themselves and bring demons into our dimension. So and then they become a big problem throughout many comic book issues. They kind of, these demonic fake people, powerful people, rich people, influential people become kind of main enemies throughout the comic, the main villain. And the story becomes bigger and more epic. Also, as I said, the world is not static. At the beginning of the story of Gea, humans are not aware of monsters, and they think monsters are an illusion, a fantasy. But then later on, little by little, as these dimensional intrusions of monsters and creatures are becoming more and more frequent, and at the end there is just a full-scale invasion. Everybody becomes aware of these monsters, their existence, and there is panic, and there is right out war, and there is an apocalyptic scenario where a lot of people are killed off, murdered by this alien invasion that happens en masse, and the army cannot fight them because there are too many, and it's kind of a battle, decisive battle between humanity and demonic entities and other dimensions. It just becomes just an epic story of enormous proportions, but it starts so small. And that's something that kind of blew my mind. Such a change in the format of the comic. One gets used to it, these simple stories, these small stories of this teenager girl and a few monsters here and there in this peaceful society. And then there is like at the end, it's like this gigantic epic story where everything changes, and there's this post-apocalyptic society that is produced in the end, and I never experienced nothing like it in any comic I ever read. So that's a very good thing about Gea. So I think that kind of wraps it up. About the negatives, not much to say, not much to tell. I will just be. It's just so well made that here and there are some, what I might mention as a negative side here and there, because Luca Enoch is trying to have this realistic style of comic books. The only kind of bad side would be that here and there his drawings are too realistic. His conversion from reality to comic books is sometimes done in a way that looks kinda off. In a way, sometimes his drawings take too much from reality, and they do not work in comic book visual aesthetics. I will try to show you some examples here on the screen so you can better understand what I'm talking about. But really there's not much I can complain about this comic book. It's a great comic book, and I hope that it will be translated into English so a much larger audience can enjoy it, because it's such a great story, and it's a shame not to read it. Oh boy, this is a long video. Well, anyway, Hopefully it's interesting, and this would be it from me. So take care. Thank you for all the likes. If you subscribe, it helps this channel grow. It helps me produce more of these videos. Take care and see you in the next video. Bye.